Following the collapse of Persian power around 480 BCE, Teres I of the Odrysian tribe became the first leader in recorded history to unify all the Thracian tribes into one kingdom. The Odrysians' consolidation of power and wealth was unprecedented for that time in the region, and it allowed them to influence events in parts of northern and Aegean coastal Greece, the western coasts of the Black Sea, the Bosporan Kingdom, Crimea, and even Scythia, until weakening by 400 BCE. Now, several generations of Odrysian kings, who had accumulated unprecedented wealth and power, must have had a Y chromosome. While no ancient samples linked to the Odrysian kings have been DNA tested, I think that they were most likely haplogroup I2a-Y3120, a line that is most likely indigenous to Bulgaria and Romania based on ancient samples that have been DNA tested. In this video, I'll present some of the interesting ways the Odrysians and later Geto-Dacian tribes may be associated with the major branches of I2a-Y3120. This shouldn't be controversial among those who believe that this line most likely originated close to its Bronze Age ancient cousin samples, though this is far away from a proposed homeland in Polesia that I read is an alternative theory proposed on exploreyourdna.com. I'll also present a concise survey of other haplogroups found in Bulgaria and Romania since the Copper Age, and why it doesn't look likely that any of them sired the Odrysian kings, mostly because they don't have any subclade that proliferated in the late Iron Age to the extent that a powerful dynasty would have, like how we see with I2a-Y3120.
This is the life-sized mask, probably belonging to King Teres I, unearthed in a mound at the Valley of the Thracian Kings, Kazanlak region, central Bulgaria. The mask is made of 23.5 karat gold and weighs 2/3 of a kilogram, or 1.3 pounds. The sensational discovery was made by Professor Georgy Kitov and his team in August 2004. According to him, there have been other gold masks discovered, but all of them are made of foil-thin gold. Gold masks with this shape and weight are absolutely unknown. That's how rich he was.
The armies of Teres I, who reigned from the 470s to 440s BCE, primarily utilized high mobile light infantry, peltists, and elite fast-striking cavalry. The kingdom Teres founded was known as the Odrysian Kingdom, named after his tribe, whose male line descendants ruled in various forms for the next few hundred years, though noticeably weakened by 400 BCE. So the pinnacle of Odrysian power was reached within the first few generations of Teres' dynasty. During this period, the Odrysian kingdom halted the southward expansion of the Scythians and entered into an interdependent relationship with them. The Odrysians engaged in diplomatic marriages with Scythians and, under Sitalkes, even intervened in Scythian civil wars. Greek historians considered the Thracians to be a numerous people, and their country, Thrace, to be of barely comprehensible size, so large that Andron of Halicarnassus, writing in the 4th century BCE, thought of it as a continent of its own. While the boundaries of Thrace fluctuated throughout history, Thrace can be divided into a northern and a southern half, which were also culturally different. This is what I read on Wikipedia. The border between the two halves has been identified as the Haemus Mountains or the Danube slightly further north. So according to the Greeks, those we know later as Geto-Dacian tribes would have inhabited the culturally different, though related, northern half of Thrace. The influence of the Odrysians in the northern Black Sea region was not limited to contacts with the Scythians. In 438 BCE, Spartocus I, believed to have been a Thracian mercenary with connections to the Odrysian kingdom, usurped the throne of the Bosporan Kingdom from the Greek dynasty. Spartocus I, while of unknown origin himself, did sire a pedigree of kings that ruled ancient Crimea until 108 BCE. In this hypothetical I2a-Y3120 as Teres I tree, I've assigned the subclade with greatest frequency in Ukraine to represent Spartocus I, the usurper of the Bosporan Kingdom. Note that this subclade, I-Y4460, is found to actually descend from a common ancestor with prolific I-S17250 on the Y-fold tree. Their common line represents the main line of I2a-Y3120, comprising the bulk of modern-day descendants. I speculate that their common ancestor was the son of Teres named Spartocos, the father of Seuthes I. I have assigned IY18331 to Sadokos, son of Sitalkes, who was known to have married the daughter of the Athenian ambassador, moved to Athens, and to have been granted citizenship. I think that the very consistent distribution within Greece of a approximately 195 BCE TMRCA subclade is more plausibly explained in this way than as a coincidental co-migration of Slavic invaders during the much later migration period, which is an interpretation of I2a-Y3120 in which every migration happens much later, after the ethnogenesis of Slavs. On this map, you can see the two oldest ancient I2a-Y3120 samples in relation to the Dacian kingdom under Burebista. Those are RAM13 from Ramnicello, Muntenia, and PL057 from Grodek, Lublin. Actually, Grodek is off the map, about 170 kilometers walk north from the closest point along the Dniester under the supposed control of Burebista. As this sample dates to after the Dacian conquest up to the Dniester, it could conceivably descend from an ancestor who originally lived within the Dacian core zone and had taken part in the Dacian invasion or expansion. Note that POH41 and POH44 from Pohansko in Czechia have a most recent common ancestor with the Grodek sample, estimated to have lived around 50 CE. I actually think that the most recent common ancestor of all three may have been living somewhere around Dokidava, where I've circled in brown, in the Dacian core zone. This looks like the regional center from which Dacians launched campaigns to Bohemia and to the Dniester. The other sample from Pohansko is in a different subclade of IS17250. Notably absent from these ancient sites in Poland and Czechia is IY4460. This makes sense if my assumption is correct that line are the descendants of Spartocos I of the Bosporan Kingdom, which is very far to the east, right along the Black Sea coast in Crimea.
Here is a map showing all Chalcolithic and Bronze Age ancient samples that are among IY3120's closest relatives, descending from a common ancestor, IS10302, who lived in the 6th millennium BCE. So far, they've only been found in modern Romania and Bulgaria. Interestingly, the oldest IY3120 sample so far found, RAM13 from Ramnicello, Muntenia, was found only about 50 kilometers away from the Bronze Age site Carlo Manesti Arman, which also happens to be IY3120's closest male-line relative among the rest of the samples on the map. If RAM13 was an apple who didn't fall far from the tree, then we may assume he descended on the male line from Getai tribesmen indigenous to the region of Muntenia, even though FTDNA says the cultural group is Sarmatian of that ancient sample. From some earlier studies I did on the subclades of IY3120 several years ago, I noticed that IY4460 had a much different distribution than the other subclades of IY3120. It is much more common in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. There are several relative maxima, one of them being along the eastern coast of the Azov Sea, where the Maeotian tribes had been living. Another is just north of Dnipro, where the Crimean Greeks and Armenians were initially resettled by Catherine the Great. Let's learn about the Bosporan Kingdom, whose Thracian kings, I believe, may have introduced this line to the region. In the 4th to 3rd century BCE, the Bosporan Kingdom was at the height of its economic and cultural development. It controlled the eastern half of the Crimean Peninsula, the lower Kuban region, and the eastern Azov steppes, which were settled by Maeotian tribes. Apart from the capital of Pantikapaon, other major cities belonging to the kingdom included Tiritaka, Nymphaeum, and Theodosia on the Crimean Peninsula, Phanagoria and Hermonasa in the lower reaches of the Kuban River, and Tanais at the Don River estuary, near today's Aziv in Rostov. The king's power was almost unlimited. Grain growing, orcharding, viticulture, fishing, the skilled trades, particularly artistic metalworking, and trade, particularly in grain, were highly developed. Its manufactured goods were sold to neighboring Scythians and Sarmatians, and I'll also mention they had a longstanding, like most favored nation trading status with Athens. They were shipping a lot of grain to the Athenians. In the second half of the 2nd BCE, the Bosporan Kingdom was shaken by a socio-economic and political crisis. Threatened by the Scythians, who had captured almost all of the Crimea, the Bosporan king Perisades V decided in 107 BCE to seek the protection of the Pontic king Mithridates VI. But the local Scythians, under the leadership of Salmachus, revolted and killed Perisades. The revolt was put down by Mithridates' general Diophantus, and the Bosporan Kingdom was then annexed by the Pontic Kingdom. So this is the first time that the Bosporan Kingdom then wasn't independent anymore. When Mithridates was defeated by the Romans in 63 BC, the kingdom came under Roman rule. Under Roman rule, the Bosporan Kingdom experienced another period of economic and cultural prosperity in the 1st to 2nd century AD. The old cities were rebuilt and new cities were established. Many Sarmatians settled in the kingdom, and this caused its culture to become somewhat Sarmatianized. If the Spartocid kings of the Bosporan Kingdom were the original carriers of I-Y4460, then during the time of their kingdom, this haplogroup would have been concentrated mostly around Pantikapaon, modern Kerch. This was the capital and where the kings were living. Notably, one of the two sons who ruled jointly in the 3rd generation, Gorgippus, based himself in Gorgippia on the Taman Peninsula side of the Kerch Strait to the east. This town was actually originally called Syndike and was the capital of the Syndike Kingdom. He became their king, and that's why he ended up living in their capital. It is now called Anapa of Krasnodar Krai and is one of the largest children's resorts in Russia. Here you can see that there is enough rapid proliferation of IY4460 into successive subclades over the next several hundred years to account for every single king in recorded history that are descendants of Spartacus I, the kings of the Bosporan Kingdom. There's even a few more that I found listed, but the author of that list said that those kings were only maybe the son of Spartacus V or whoever's down at the bottom of this list. This is just something where I put a name to each subclade in order to just get a rough idea of, like, are there enough branches here that it could be a match to the Spartocid dynasty? And I think that there are. The regional power on the western side of Crimea was the independent Greek colony of Chersonesos. The relationship between the Bosporan Kingdom and Chersonesos was characterized by intense competition for control over the Crimean Peninsula, alternating between warfare and periods of enforced alliance. I've actually visited the ruins at Chersones several years back. This ancient fortress lies on the outskirts of Sevastopol. Chersonesos means peninsula in Greek. This was many years before I was interested in Y-DNA. While this haplogroup has not yet been found in any Crimean Greeks, the sample size from the Crimean Greeks project on FTDNA is tiny, with just 6 Greek-speaking Rumes and 3 Turkic-speaking Urums. I don't know if Eastern Crimea is well represented in these samples. Certainly, I wouldn't expect a Greek from Chersonesos to be IY4460 because the Bosporan Kingdom never successfully conquered the city. However, I think any Greeks or even Tatars, and I'll get to that later, originally coming from the areas under control of the Bosporan Kingdom would have the possibility of being IY4460. There are 0 samples, however, in this haplogroup tracing descent to Donetsk. That's the oblast of Mariupol, where most Crimean Greeks were resettled by Catherine the Great. However, there are 3 samples in Dnipropetrovsk, out of a total of 18 with this regional code, meaning 1 in 6 samples from Dnipropetrovsk are IY4460. This is where the Crimean Greeks lived in peasants' homes for 2 years before being resettled to Priazov. That means the land in front of Azov Sea. And there are a total of 5 IY4460 samples in neighboring Kharkiv and Poltava oblasts. While these men could possibly descend from Crimean Greeks through an NPE during their Greek ancestors' temporary stay in Dnipro, they could have much deeper roots in the area. After all, there is ancient sample VK542 from Chernihiv Oblast, which is northeast of Kiev, dating to 1100 CE. The migration of a Kerch Strait line so far to the north could have come about through direct contacts between Kievan Rus and Tmutarakan, a principality that controlled the Kerch Strait, known in antiquity as the Cimmerian Bosporus. Kievan Rus gained control of Tmutarakan sometime in the late 10th century. Mail lines from this region, including Tanais, would likely also have become integrated within the Khazar state and possibly recruited into their armies. So the ancestors of VK542 may have been some kind of Khazar overseers, keeping the locals around Kiev or Chernihiv in check. As you can see in this map, Kiev and surrounding areas to the north were under direct control of the Khazars for a time. Another migration further to the west, to Austria, also needs to be reckoned with for I-Y4460, because according to FTDNA, 4 samples of this subclade were found in an Avar context around 800 CE at Mödling an der Goldenen Stiege in Lower Austria. Other subclades of IY3120 are also represented there. Is this proof that IY4460 could not have originated from the Spartocid clan that ruled the Bosporan Kingdom? Austria is far from either side of the Kerch Straits, after all. But maybe not, because the Avars passed through the steppes just north of there. Spartacus founded a dynasty which seems to have endured until 110 BCE, known as the Spartacids. The Spartacids left many inscriptions, indicating that the earliest members of the house ruled under the titles of archons of the Greek cities and kings of various minor native tribes, notably the Sindi from central Crimea and other branches of the Meotii. They were known to have engaged in diplomatic marriages with Scythians. I couldn't find any attestation of Avars having raided any cities of the Bosporan Kingdom. However, given that the Avars were the dominant power in the neighboring steppes, it is conceivable that offspring of the Spartokids, living among the Meotii or Scythian tribes, might have become integrated, willingly or by force, within groups that accompanied the Avars on military expeditions to Central Europe. We also know that the Huns destroyed the capital city, Pantikapaon, even before the Avars. So there could even have been some forced migrations or willingly joining the Huns, like some offspring of the Spartokids living among the neighboring tribes may have joined with the Huns in the destruction of the capital of the Bosporan Kingdom. Did Attila have units from the Bosporan Kingdom under his command? Google AI says, based on historical accounts, it is highly probable that remnants or soldiers from the former Bosporan Kingdom were part of the multi-ethnic army under Attila the Hun. Therefore, while there may not be specific contemporary records detailing a Bosporan regiment, quote unquote, in the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, the people of the Crimea served as vassals or auxiliaries within the Hunnic Confederation. I then checked the Crimean Tatar project on FTDNA, and I had a bit of luck. I made the discovery that the single Crimean Tatar positive for IY3118, one of the prolific lines of I2a-Y4460, traces his male line to Yedi-Kuyu Rayoni. This comes up on Google Maps as Lenino village, the easternmost Crimean Tatar-speaking community on the map from Wikipedia, and less than 60 kilometers west of Kerch, the site of ancient Pantikapaon. Well, I think it is possible that this male line from Yedi-Kuyu may have mostly stayed in that general area, since descending from a Spartocid king from Pantikapaon. It could also be a back migration from some of his descendants that had been living along the coasts of Azov, offspring of diplomatic marriages, for example. So the Tatarization of this sample's ancestor could have happened anywhere along the coasts of Azov, Tanais, if not in eastern Crimea itself. We actually have a potentially smoking gun for an association of this haplogroup to ancient Crimea. Sample AS13, dated to 200 to 50 BCE from the Kerkenetida necropolis near Evpatoria. Kerkenetida was a significant Greek settlement that existed for about 700 years. The necropolis reflects the complex, mixed character of the population, which included Greek settlers, Scythians, and Taurians. Taurians refers to native inhabitants of Crimea. This sample was found positive for the Bronze Age parent haplogroup of I-Y3120, known as ICTS10228, but it was too degraded to confirm whether it was positive or negative for any major downstream line. However, given that 99.9% of all samples positive for this Bronze Age line are in fact descendants of the prolific Iron Age IY3120, we could safely assume that AS13 would also be positive. If the two options for the deeper origin of AS13 are Geto-Dacian lines of IY3120 or Spartocid kings of the Bosporan Kingdom IY4460, I would consider a proximal origin in the Bosporan Kingdom more likely, but I don't consider the distance from Dacia to western Crimea to have been insurmountable for a migration from the west, i.e. a Dacian that was Scythianized. So I don't think it makes sense to consider IY3120 to have been an originally Scythian haplogroup because the older Scythian samples are representing other haplogroups. They're representing other haplogroups of I2 or R1a, and this as prolific as IY3120 was in the Iron Age, if it really were an ancient Scythian original haplogroup, then there should be way more of them found in the older Scythian samples, not only being found on a really peripheral site where Greeks and other native Crimeans were also found. Now let's examine IY4460's distribution within Russia. Nearly half of the samples from Russia are from the Volga, Southern, and North Caucasian federal districts. Over 10% are from Ural, Siberia, or Far East, places where Stalin exiled ethnic minorities. Is this the distribution we would expect of a line from the homeland of the Slavs? Or rather, one that was originally concentrated around the Kerch Strait? I'm not a subject matter expert on the ethnogenesis of the Slavs, so I leave it to those of you who are to ponder that question. The last subclade of IY3120 I will discuss is IPH908. It is one of the principal haplogroups of Serbia, found in about 25% of males, according to a 2019 study. In contrast to the other major subclades of IY3120, this subclade is much younger, estimated to descend from one man who lived around 1 BCE, according to FTDNA, and is much more concentrated in geographic distribution. Ancient samples have only been found in Avar period Lower Austria and medieval Hungary, and modern distribution is mostly limited to Serbia and neighboring countries. The first sons of IPH908 likely lived among Geto-Dacian tribes that, due to geography and timing, tended to migrate almost exclusively to Serbia. Dacians expanded into present-day Serbia and established control over the region after defeating the Celtic Skordiski under King Burebista, roughly between 56 and 50 BCE. This conquest followed the rapid decline of Skordiski power, which was accelerated by Roman defeats in the late 2nd century BCE, and later by pressure from the rising Dacian kingdom to the east. I'm not sure what became of those Dacians in Serbia once Rome reasserted itself in the region, with Tiberius conquering parts of Serbia in campaigns between 13 and 9 BCE. On at least 3 separate occasions, later, the Romans resettled Geto-Dacian Moesia Superior, the province roughly corresponding to modern Serbia. First, during the Augustan period, Aelius Catus resettled 50,000 Getae from north of the Danube to Moesia, and thereafter they were referred to as Moesi, a tribal name made up by the Romans. Evidence exists in Vidin and western Montana provinces of Bulgaria in the form of a rapid influx of new settlements and cemeteries in the 1st century CE, corroborating the northern origin of these populations. Again, in 106 CE, following the conquest of Dacia, Romans resettled additional Dacians from north of the Danube to Moesia Superior. And again, following the abandonment of the province of Dacia, around 271-275 CE by Emperor Aurelian, the Roman administration was shifted south of the Danube. A new province, Dacia Aureliana, was created in territories of modern Serbia, moving with it a large number of Romanized Dacians, officials, and soldiers. The Romans often moved conquered populations to break local power structures, and in the case of the Dacians, to alleviate the pressure of the free Dacians, who continued to raid the empire from the north. Given that IPH 908's TMRCA is about 1 BCE, centuries before the ethnogenesis of the Slavs, I think that this was originally a Geto-Dacian haplogroup. One notoriously powerful leader from around that time was Burebista, who united Dacian tribes into a kingdom. Regardless of who the founder of IPH 908 was, if he were a Geto-Dacian, then some of his offspring would have been relocated by Romans to Upper Moesia prior to the migration of the Slavs. Later, free Dacian IPH 908 descendants would have integrated within Sclaveni. It may seem counterintuitive, but it makes sense. Essentially, we are looking at two migrations from the same origin, Geto-Dacian homelands, to the same destinations, Serbia. The modern distribution of lines of IPH 908 representing an earlier versus a later migration to Serbia would look identical if no one was left behind. Ancient DNA would be required to prove that a particular line was present in Serbia prior to the Slavic migrations. So far, none exists. One other clue regarding IPH 908 is that it hasn't been found in any ancient context any further north than the 8th century Mödling site of Lower Austria. Several other, slightly later samples are found in Hungary. This could be an indicator that the founder lived after the Dacian expansion to the Dniester, southern Poland, and Bohemia. One interesting candidate to consider as founder of IPH 908 is Cotiso, who ruled the southwesternmost splinter kingdom, centered around Banat and Oltenia, after the disintegration of unified Dacia that followed the assassination of Burebista. He was powerful enough to have been courted by both Augustus and Mark Antony, and had enough forces at his disposal to conduct regular raids across the Danube. While Cotiso exerted influence across parts of northern Serbia between 35 and 29 BCE, there may not have been significant Y chromosome displacement of IPH 908 into the region until after the Romans began crossing the Danube and transferring Geto-Dacian populations to Moesia en masse. One possible indicator of whether a line of IPH 908 migrated to Moesia as resettled Geto-Dacians rather than as invading Sclaveni could lie in the substructure of a lineage. Growth during the 6th and 7th centuries may be indicative of a line that invaded as Sclaveni, and the growth could have been before and or after the migration to Serbia. What is fascinating is how completely Romania got flushed of this haplogroup. Only 4 of 163 samples from Romania are positive, which is less than 2.5%. We analyzed Bronze Age Bulgarian R1b Yamnaya sample BOY009 at YSeq. He's in Yamnaya R1b Z2109 subclade and had a negative for the major CTS 7556 subclade that most modern Europeans in R1b Z2109 descend from. So this would be a very unlikely candidate for the Odrysian kings because there is no corresponding subclade in this position with anything like the Iron Age growth that the Odrysians haplogroup should exhibit. Likewise, EV13 appears a weak candidate for the Odrysian dynasty because the most highly resolved Iron Age sample from Kapitan Andreevo, Haskovo, Bulgaria, I2a-Y3120 from Lazaridis 2022, is in a subclade with no Iron Age growth, EFGC 68911. This sample is related to a later ancient sample from Viminacium, so they were no doubt in the general area, but their male line was not prolific by any means.